The rain fell relentlessly on the small countryside cemetery, the gray sky mirroring the grief that weighed on every heart present. A little girl no older than 7 clutched a single white rose in her trembling hand, her eyes swollen from days of endless tears. Her name was Emily, and today she was burying the only parent who had ever truly loved her, her father. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, she wanted to scream, to cry out for him to come back, but no sound escaped her lips. Only the harsh, cold wind seemed to acknowledge her pain. But just when Emily thought the world couldn't hurt more, it did. Standing a few steps away was her stepmother, a woman who wore a black veil not out of grief but out of duty. Her face was unreadable, her eyes cold and distant. And when the final prayer ended, and mourners slowly began to leave, Emily reached for her stepmother's hand, only to feel it pulled sharply away. With a voice that cut sharper than the wind, her stepmother whispered the words that would change the little girl's life forever. "You're not my responsibility anymore. Your father is gone. You have no place in my home." The ground beneath Emily's feet felt like it was collapsing. She looked up, her small body trembling, but all she saw was the back of the woman walking away into the misty rain, leaving her with nothing but her tiny suitcase and the rose she still held tightly. Alone. Abandoned. On the very day she had lost her father. Backhand index pointing right. If you believe kindness and second chances can change lives, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Kindness Glow. Your support helps us spread more stories that heal the heart. Emily stood frozen, her dress soaked through, shivering against the biting wind. She didn't know where to go. Her father's house was no longer hers. The stepmother who had promised to care for her had cast her aside like an unwanted burden. She clutched her suitcase tighter, the old handle digging into her small hand, as if holding on to the last piece of stability she had. The rain showed no mercy. Soon, her shoes were caked with mud as she wandered down the empty road beyond the cemetery. Each step was heavy, not just from the cold but from the weight of sorrow pressing down on her tiny shoulders. Memories of her father flooded her mind, his laughter, his warm embrace, the way he would call her, "my brave little star." But now, there was no one left to call her that. Hunger gnawed at her stomach. She hadn't eaten since the day before. Her father's death had turned everything upside down. For 2 nights leading to the funeral, she had been forced to sleep in a cold corner of the house, ignored, her tears dismissed as noise. Now, she had no roof at all. Hours passed, and the storm grew darker. Emily found herself sitting beneath an old oak tree by the roadside, her suitcase beside her, her arms wrapped around her knees. She tried to keep warm by rocking herself back and forth, but nothing seemed to help. The loneliness cut deeper than the cold. At just 7 years old, the world had already shown her a cruelty most grown adults would struggle to endure. Cars passed by occasionally, splashing muddy water near her feet, but no one stopped. To them, she was just a drenched child in the rain, someone else's problem. And every passing moment made her feel smaller, more invisible, as if the world had already forgotten she existed. As dusk began to fall, a sleek black car appeared on the horizon. Its headlights sliced through the rain and fog, illuminating the trembling figure of the little girl beneath the tree. The car slowed as it drew closer, finally coming to a halt just a few feet away. The engine's hum quieted, and for a moment, silence blanketed the storm. Inside sat a man in his mid-40s, dressed in a tailored suit. His presence radiated authority and success, but his eyes, sharp yet weary, revealed a depth of pain he rarely showed to anyone. He was Alexander Carter, a wealthy businessman known across the city for his ruthless drive and towering empire. Yet behind that reputation was a man who had quietly built walls around his heart after suffering losses of his own. He wasn't searching for anyone to break those walls. But tonight, fate had other plans. Through the windshield, he saw Emily's fragile figure, soaked and shivering. Something inside him stirred, a memory, perhaps, of his own childhood, of nights when he too had felt abandoned and unloved. Without thinking, he opened his door and stepped into the rain, his polished shoes sinking into the wet earth. He walked toward her, his heart pounding for reasons he couldn't explain. Emily looked up, startled by the tall figure standing above her. For a moment, fear flickered in her eyes, but it quickly gave way to something else, hope. A stranger had stopped. Someone had noticed her. Alexander knelt down, his coat shielding her from the rain. His gaze fell upon the rose still clutched in her hand, and then to her tear-streaked face. He didn't need to ask what had happened. The pain in her eyes told him everything. And then, with a voice that cut through the storm like thunder, he shouted into the night as if speaking not just to Emily but to the world that had failed her, "Stop. Enough. This child will not be abandoned, not tonight, not ever again." The words echoed in Emily's ears, filling her with warmth she hadn't felt since her father's last embrace. For the first time in days, she let herself believe she might not be alone anymore. Alexander's voice carried power, but behind it was a heart that had not spoken with such emotion in years. He wasn't a man who usually let his feelings show. His life was defined by contracts, skyscrapers, and meetings that never ended. Yet here he was, kneeling in the mud before a broken child, declaring to the storm that her suffering would end. He wrapped his coat around Emily's small body and lifted her gently into his arms. She weighed so little, as if sorrow had stolen her strength. Her head rested against his chest, and for the first time since her father's funeral, she felt warmth. She clung to him tightly, not knowing who he was, not caring, only desperate for the safety he seemed to promise. The car ride was silent except for the sound of rain hammering against the roof. Alexander glanced at her through the rearview mirror as his driver navigated the dark roads back to the city. Emily's eyes stared out the window, wide and haunted. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't ask who he was. Children abandoned too many times learn quickly that questions don't always lead to answers. When they arrived at Alexander's grand estate, Emily's breath caught. The mansion loomed large, with glowing lights and stone pillars rising into the night sky. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. But for her, it wasn't the size of the house that mattered, it was whether it could finally be a home. Inside, warmth and golden light replaced the cold darkness outside. The staff hurried forward, surprised to see their employer carrying a child. Alexander, usually composed and detached, now seemed like a man with a mission. He instructed them to prepare a guest room, bring warm food, and find dry clothes. His voice carried urgency that allowed no argument. Emily was led upstairs, bathed, and dressed in soft pajamas far too big for her small frame. She ate slowly, almost cautiously, as if afraid the meal might be taken away at any moment. Alexander watched from a distance, his heart twisting with every small motion she made. He recognized the signs, hesitation, guardedness, the silence of a child who had been forced to grow up too quickly. That night, when the house grew quiet, Alexander stood outside her room. Through the slightly open door, he saw Emily curled up in bed, clutching her suitcase like a shield. She refused to let it out of her sight. Perhaps it carried the last fragments of her father's love, clothes he had bought her, maybe a photograph, or a keepsake that reminded her she was once cherished. Alexander could have walked away. He could have told himself that he had done enough, that providing a roof and food was all he owed. But something inside him wouldn't allow it. For years, he had lived behind walls of steel and glass, convinced that opening his heart was weakness. But this child's silent suffering had cracked those walls. He saw in her reflection of his own past, the nights he too had wondered if love had forgotten him. Days turned into weeks. Slowly, Emily began to settle into the house. At first, she remained silent, speaking only when asked. She flinched whenever a door closed too loudly, as if expecting someone to scold her. She ate quietly, often waiting until everyone else was finished, afraid she wasn't allowed to take more. But little by little, the walls she had built around herself began to show cracks. One afternoon, Alexander found her in the garden. She was kneeling by the flowers, her small hands gently touching the petals. For the first time, he saw her smile, a faint, fleeting smile, but real. It lit up her face like sunshine breaking through clouds. He felt something stir inside him, something he had thought was lost forever. Still, shadows lingered. At night, Alexander would sometimes hear her muffled sobs echoing down the hall. She never cried in front of anyone. She carried her grief like a secret, locked deep inside. He longed to tell her she didn't have to, that she was safe now, that someone would fight for her. But words failed him. He had spent so long hiding his own pain that speaking of it felt impossible. The turning point came on a stormy evening, not unlike the night he had first found her. Emily sat by the window, clutching a framed photograph from her suitcase. It was of her father, smiling with an arm wrapped around her shoulders. She whispered to the picture, her voice trembling, "Daddy, I miss you. I don't know why she didn't want me. I promise I'll be good. Please come back. Alexander stood in the doorway, his heart breaking. He realized then that this little girl's battle was not just against hunger or loneliness, it was against the crushing belief that she was unworthy of love. That belief, if left unhealed, would follow her for the rest of her life. For the first time in many years, Alexander let his guard down. He entered the room, knelt beside her, and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. And though he didn't yet know how, Alexander silently vowed that he would not let her carry this pain alone. What Emily didn't know was that Alexander's past carried wounds of its own. His wealth had been built on a relentless climb to the top, but success had come at the cost of family. He had lost someone he loved deeply years ago, and ever since, he had convinced himself that caring too much only led to pain. Yet here was this child, fragile and abandoned, forcing him to remember that love, though risky, was the very thing that could heal them both. As the weeks stretched into months, their bond deepened. Alexander began taking time away from his empire to spend with Emily. He taught her chess, read her bedtime stories in his study, and listened quietly when she finally began to share small fragments of her memories. She told him about her father's laugh, the songs he used to sing, and the way he called her his brave little star. Every word was a thread weaving their lives closer together. But the outside world hadn't forgotten Emily. One day, whispers of her situation reached the ears of her stepmother. Greed, not guilt, drove the woman back. She had heard rumors that the child now lived under the roof of Alexander Carter, the man whose wealth and influence were unmatched. Suddenly, the girl she had abandoned became valuable again. The stepmother's return would soon test the fragile hope Emily had found. And Alexander would have to decide how far he was willing to go to protect the little girl who had already stolen his guarded heart. It was a crisp spring morning when the storm of the past returned to Emily's life. The mansion gates opened to reveal a figure no one had expected to see again, her stepmother. She arrived not in grief, but in arrogance, her eyes gleaming with calculation. Clad in expensive clothing she had likely bought with the inheritance she had stolen, she demanded to see Emily. The staff hesitated, but Alexander came forward, his expression sharp. He knew immediately what this was. She had no interest in the child's well-being, her sudden return was about control, power, and the possibility of wealth. Rumors spread quickly in the city, and she had clearly learned that Emily was living with a man of immense fortune. To her, Emily was no longer a burden, she was a ticket to influence. When Emily saw her stepmother standing at the gates, her small body froze. She dropped the toy she had been holding and stepped backward, her face pale. Memories of rejection, hunger, and abandonment came rushing back. Her heart pounded in terror. Alexander placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're safe," he whispered firmly. And he meant it. The stepmother demanded custody. She spoke of family rights, of being Emily's guardian now that her father was gone. Her words were sharp and rehearsed, but her eyes betrayed her greed. She wasn't there for love, she was there to take back what she thought she could use. For the first time in years, Alexander felt fury unlike anything he had known in business. He had built empires, faced rivals, and conquered challenges, but nothing compared to the battle for this child's future. He refused to let Emily be dragged back into the hands of someone who had thrown her away like yesterday's shadow. The fight moved to the courtroom. The walls echoed with legal arguments, but beyond the papers and evidence, it was Emily's fragile voice that turned the tide. When the judge asked her where she wanted to live, she clutched Alexander's hand and whispered, "I just want to stay where I feel safe. Please don't send me back to her. She left me in the rain after my daddy's funeral. He said I was his brave little star, and I think he sent Mr. Alexander to find me when I was alone." The courtroom grew silent. Even the judge's stern expression softened as tears welled in her eyes. It was no longer just a case, it was the story of a child's survival, her plea for love, her fight for a home. The ruling came swiftly. Custody was granted to Alexander Carter. The stepmother's protests fell on deaf ears. Her greed was laid bare, and the law stood firm. Emily would never again be at her mercy. As the gavel struck, Emily turned to Alexander, her small face breaking into tears, not of sorrow, but of relief. She wrapped her arms around him, and for the first time, he allowed himself to weep too. The walls he had built for decades crumbled completely, replaced by a love he had thought he no longer deserved. From that day forward, Emily's life transformed. The mansion was no longer just a house, it became her home. The staff became her family. Alexander became not just her guardian, but her protector, her teacher, and slowly, the father figure she had lost. She blossomed. She laughed again, ran through the gardens with joy, and filled the once quiet halls with the sound of her music and chatter. Alexander, in turn, rediscovered life's greatest treasure, not wealth or success, but the power of kindness, love, and second chances. Years later, Emily would grow to tell others her story. She would speak of the night she was abandoned, of the man who stopped his car in the rain, and of the single word he shouted that changed everything: stop. That night, kindness had stepped in. That night, her life was saved. Backhand index pointing right. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, share it with friends and family, and subscribe to Kindness Glow. Every click helps us spread more stories of compassion, healing, and the power of second chances. Speech balloon special request: comment below with the words, "Kindness can change everything," if you believe every child deserves love and protection. Because sometimes, it only takes one act of kindness to rewrite an entire life.